Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a December 30th, 2005 essay written by Mr. John Dean entitled George W. Bush as the New Richard Nixon, both wiretapped illegally and impeachably.
Without objection.
Mr. Dean, how many American presidents have you accused of being Richard Nixon?
I actually wrote a book about Mr. Bush and Mr. Cheney with the title Worse Than Watergate.
So it's sort of become a cottage. Did you make money on that book?
It was a very successful book,
How much
yes.
money did you make on it?
I'm sorry, I don't have any idea.
More than $1 million?
No.
More than $500,000?
I said I don't have any idea.
How much money do you make from CNN?
I don't really know exactly.
I think I'm going to object to the
Wait a second. Mr. Dean has made a cottage industry out of accusing presidents of acting like Richard Nixon. I would like to know how much money he makes based on making these accusations and exploiting them for his own economic benefit. And you're saying that's
Mr. Gaetz, Mr. Gaetz, I appreciate you were not born at the time this all happened. It's not by choice that I've done a lot of this. It's that I've been dragged into it.
Who forced you to accuse George W. Bush of being Richard Nixon?
Who forced me to? It was right after I had spent 10 years in a lawsuit knocking down false statements about what my role had and hadn't been.
Well, let's speak now to the truth or falsity of statements. Do you have personal knowledge regarding the truth or falsity of a single material fact in the Mueller report?
I think if you recall, the first thing I said, I'm not here as a fact witness.
You're here to provide historical context.
Exactly.
And throughout history, you accuse presidents of acting like Richard Nixon, and you make money off of it, right?
Not all presidents, no.
No, but a few more than one.
Those who do act like him, I pointed out.
Let me ask you this question. How do Democrats plan to pay for Medicare for all?
I'm sorry?
Well, I figured if we were going to ask you about stuff you don't know about, we'd start with the big stuff. So do you know how they plan to pay for Medicare for all?
Who? The Democrats or which candidate? Or can you be more specific?
Let's get specific to Nixon, since that appears to be why you're here. Do you believe?
Well, actually, Nixon did have a health care plan.
Good. You are functionally here as a prop because they can't impeach President Trump because 70% of Democrats want something that 60% of Americans don't. So they're in this no-win situation, and you sit before us here with no knowledge of a single fact on the Mueller report on a hearing entitled Lessons from the Mueller Report.
Mr. Gaetz, can I answer your question, please?
It's not your time, Mr. Dean. It's my time. So here's the deal, right? We have a false accusation against the President of the United States that he was an agent of Russia. My colleagues on the Democratic side made that accusation. And so where do we go from here?
From the state that brought you the 2000 recount, we have Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. Gaetz attempts here to frame Nixon counsel and star witness during the Watergate scandal, John Dean, as someone who has no business offering historical context from the Nixon era as it relates to Trump, who is also facing possible impeachment like Nixon, for the same charges as Nixon. Honestly, the stuff that Gaetz assumes Dean knows nothing about is quite literally what he's known for. He's written more than half a dozen books on the topic, a point that Gaetz tried to frame as disqualifying rather than being clear evidence of his expertise. Because in Gaetz's parallel universe, facts are subjective if they're not aligned with his agenda. And clearly Gaetz was vying for some viral gotcha moment, except his disoriented line of questioning backfired on him. He suggested that while Dean is on the subject of discussing stuff he isn't qualified to discuss, that he reveal how they plan to pay for Medicare for all, and then randomly named Richard Nixon when Dean asked for specifics. Except Nixon did have a healthcare plan, and while he was no liberal icon, his healthcare plan was strikingly similar to Obamacare, which Republicans today have staked their entire careers on dismantling. Nixon's plan combined an employer mandate with subsidized private coverage for the self-employed, unemployed, and others not covered through their jobs, not unlike Obamacare. Nixon's plan also expanded Medicare to people under 65 who'd been disabled, and he funded it all through higher taxes. Through Gaetz's rambling desperation to point out that Dean isn't able to speak to facts, Dean was able to speak to facts. But Gaetz went on, digging in his heels and pounding his fists while trying to prove that the Mueller probe was a sham. He staked his argument on the idea that because Mueller didn't find that Trump was an agent of Russia, that the whole investigation was unwarranted. except that was only one of multiple allegations. There were others, including that Russian agents interfered in the 2016 election on behalf of then-candidate Trump, that the Trump campaign coordinated with Russia to influence the outcome of the election, and that Trump obstructed justice. But I guess Gaetz just conveniently forgot about those instances. Because when it came to the other accusations that Mueller looked into during his 2-year investigation, we now have definitive evidence of all of those things. We know that Russian intelligence officers did meddle in the 2016 election, that they stole information from 500,000 American voters, that they hacked into emails from the DNC and Hillary Clinton, and then released them to help then-candidate Trump. And Mueller's investigation resulted in 12 of them getting charged. We know that the officials from the Trump campaign did in fact cooperate with people with ties to Russia, including the Trump Tower meeting in which Kushner, Manafort, and Don Jr. met with a Kremlin-linked lawyer seeking dirt on Hillary Clinton, including when Mike Flynn discussed Russian sanctions with the Russian ambassador, including Paul Manafort sharing polling data with Konstantin Kilimnik, who has ties to the Kremlin, and of course, including when Trump himself asked Russia on national television to hack Hillary Clinton's emails, which they attempted to do only hours later. We know that there were instances of obstruction of justice, all of which were outlined in Mueller's report, including trying to have the special counsel himself removed, dangling pardons for those cooperating with the probe, trying to intimidate others who were cooperating with the probe, and instructing White House counsel to lie about the probe, just to name a few. And as much as Matt Gaetz and the White House would like to pretend that none of these glaringly obvious examples of wrongdoing exist, that's not how it works. Gaetz doesn't get to say, well, Mueller didn't charge Trump as a Russian agent, so none of it counts. In fact, after his performance, Gaetz really shouldn't be saying much of anything, because it seems to only hurt himself every time he does.